What's good, Podcastville? You found the BISTANDER Podcast. Today, my guest is Mark Soboil. Did I say that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Awesome. He is the proud owner of Scapes. Also lives in my neighborhood. And I thought I'd bring him out here to understand his whole business. First off, though, I understand that you used to live in South Africa, Cape Town?
Yeah. So I grew up in Cape Town.
Tell me all about that first.
Yes, I grew up in Cape Town. It's a beach town. I grew up surfing, doing a lot of sailing. A beautiful city. And I was there until my early 20s. And then I moved over to the US to study. To UW, actually, in Seattle. Wow. Yeah. So I moved out here in the early, mid-90s and finished up at the UW.
How does a young boy find University of Washington all the way from Cape Town?
Good question, actually. So my dad had actually immigrated to the U.S. in the mid-'80s, and I got an opportunity to move here. I got a green card through him. So I have a couple other siblings, but I was really the only one that kind of took up the opportunity. So I'd actually started university in South Africa already. So I thought, it'll just be an easy transition, come over, transfer. But when I got here, I realized it actually wasn't that easy. So I still had to become a Washington State resident. And then obviously getting into the UW, even back in those days, was quite tough. So I ended up working for a while just to become a Washington State resident. So I had become a scuba instructor, in my late teens, and I used to work and teach diving as a way to kind of earn extra money, kind of as I was going through university. So when I moved out here, I ended up getting a job in the Caribbean as a dive instructor. And, that's how I became a Washington State resident by working in the Caribbean for a year. But it was a way, I could get my residency because, I could show that I was kind of living with my dad, for that over that year or so. And then I came back, obviously needed to get into UW. And I think back then, the easiest way to do it, because it wasn't easy to do a transfer. I was considered a foreign student, and it's really tough. And I wouldn't say I was like the greatest student back then. So I went to a community college and for a year. And then I don't know if they still have that type of setup, but when you go to a community college, back then, you could just do a transfer after you've got your AA degree. Mm-hmm. And so I went to community college for a year, got an AA degree, I think it was, that's what it's called. And then I was able to transfer to the UW and then just finished up my undergrad there.
And what were your studies?
So my undergrad was actually in marine biology. And then I ended up getting a graduate degree in marine biology, focusing more on kind of fisheries, and I did a master's thesis in Costa Rica, and I was looking at tropical reef fish and the destruction of that fishery through the aquarium trade fishery. So they kind of focus on juvenile fish because they're kind of small and they're colorful. Mm-hmm. But it's really destructive. So I spent a good year in Costa Rica living there.
Tell me a little bit more about that, because it's interesting to me that, I understand puppy mills and such, but tropical fish, and how does it affect the coral reefs and such?
So, that's really another issue too. So a lot of the coral reefs are getting affected by just local runoff, the stream runoff. So a lot of the agriculture, the fertilizers they use kind of get mixed into, just through just general runoff gets mixed in the rainwater, and then the silts as well from the farms gets pulled in because with agriculture you're essentially removing a lot of the indigenous plant growth that the root structures are holding the soil together. So when that gets tilled, a lot of the silt then gets, kind of drains back into the river systems. And so it's a combination of the fertilizer and the silt in the water that when it gets pushed back into the ocean, that it kind of clogs up the coral, so they have difficulty surviving. And when that happens, there's like a symbiotic relationship between the coral and the algae that live in the coral. So the people don't realize that the coral's white, and the reason why it's colorful is actually the algae that lives that lives in the coral. So when the coral has difficulty surviving, the algae kind of exits, and you get coral bleaching. And that's just one component of the issue around coral dying. I mean, the other is obviously global warming and the heating up of the oceans. And
when we take those tropical fish out of those areas, does that affect the cleaning of the coral and such?
Yeah, I mean, there are like parrotfish. There are certain fish that live off the coral, but when you do remove those key players on the coral reefs, it kind of affects the whole biodiversity on the reef structure. So and it becomes really noticeable as well. So you get other, once you kind of remove a lot of those key species on the reef, you may get other animals that will come in to replace it. But it's what I noticed when I was, because they're not schooling fish as well. They're sedentary, so they tend to
be independent,
very independent, and stay in one place. And so when you remove them and you go down these reefs, particularly after a team of divers have gone down and removed a lot of those key species, you just know there's no fish on the reef. And it takes a really long time for them to get replaced.
Right.
Yeah.
We were just talking about water runoff on the streets here in Bainbridge last week, and it's supposed to be taken care of, and it's been on the docket basically for 20 years here on Bainbridge Island. How do you see? I know this is kind of out of your scope, perhaps, but what do you see a solution to, filtering the rain off? It goes right down Madison Avenue and by the ferry and enters, with the oil and the gasoline off the streets right back into the ocean. What kind of solutions might you have for something like that?
Yeah, it's interesting that, so I started this company, Scapes, about 3 years ago, started to recycle this oyster shell. So my career had kind of taken an interesting turn. I had got into a lot of fisheries management stuff, and I noticed, during COVID, I couldn't travel as much and couldn't really do some of the things that I was doing before. So we started recycling the shell because I saw these big middens. There's a lot of oyster farms in Washington, and realized there was a resource that that wasn't really being utilized. A lot of the farms, they do use the shell, but some of the shell, but majority of it just gets piled up. And so we started recycling it and looking at ways in areas that it can be used. And one demand we found was using it as a biofilter. So it turns out that oyster shell is really good at extracting the heavy metals from rainwater. So it's essentially the copper that it's removing from water. And so one way in which so a lot of the ports are starting to create these biofilters. So when the rainwater comes in and drains off, these big parking areas, they're creating these essentially these filters that are piled with shell, and the shell's extracting those heavy metals. So before it enters, the ocean, at least it's been cleaned somewhat. And it seems to be doing quite a good job. So one solution here on Bainbridge is to do that. You've got heavy traffic, a lot of the heavy metals, particularly in the tires, the way they're made. There's a lot of heavy metals kind of mixed in the rubber. So when you driving down the road with all the trucks, so that as the roads get cleaned with the rain, that just gets pulled in and that accumulates over time. Mm-hmm. And so if you had some form of these biofilters in key locations, you could begin to clean some of that rainwater before it enters the sound.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you get that mic a little closer to you?
Yeah.
You mentioned copper. How does copper get into the water?
So, I think it's just naturally one of those heavy metals that is used in a lot of manufacturing processes. So, manufacturing of tires and all sorts of things. It's just used in all components of manufacturing. So, these heavy metals, they bioaccumulate, so maybe they may be in really small amounts initially, but over time, when you're dealing with hundreds, thousands of people, when you kind of account for just for growing populations, it ends up being quite a lot of heavy metal kind of sitting in the ecosystem, and it needs to get extracted because otherwise it just kind of sits and builds up. It has a really slow half-life, so it can sit around for hundreds,
forever.
Forever, yeah.
I have so many questions, but the number one question I have for you is the sustainability of doing landscaping projects with oyster shells. Because when I grew up, my dad we would chuck oysters on the beach back when they were very plentiful. They're not so much plentiful anymore. And he always said, leave the shells on the beach so the oysters would regrow in those shells. But then I go to places like Hama Hama, the oyster bar and the oyster farm out there, and there's just snow mounds of just fractured shells. And it's not the whole shell. Where does the truth lie? Do we need to leave a certain amount of oyster shells to repopulate the oyster population? Are we damaging the oyster population by using the shells? Questions like that.
Yeah, I get asked that all the time, and I think that if you're going to be collecting oysters just from the beachfront, I would absolutely say to you, leave the shell, because the life cycle of the oyster is that when it fertilizes, so essentially it's an animal, and it's an external fertilizer. So in other words, the male and the female oysters, they will release their eggs, release the sperm into the water column, and it's within the water column that the eggs get fertilized. And once they're fertilized, the egg turns into a swimming larvae. And so they swim around part of their initial life cycle until they get to a certain size, and then they settle. And for that, so when the larva settles, it needs to settle on a hard substrate to be able to turn into an oyster that you eat. So the best substrate is other oysters. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's good. It's just good practice to be able to have put your shell back into the ocean to create that substrate. So
and that's whether you barbecue your oysters or shuck them raw.
Chuck them raw, yeah. But now, over the last few years, I would say over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a real drive to, when you go to a restaurant, you tend to want to eat a live oyster and in a half shell.
Boy, do I.
And so, if you have a natural oyster that just grows in the ocean, the shape of the shell will essentially grow to the shape of the substrate it's growing on. So when you go to a restaurant, you want a nice-looking oyster versus just a shell conglomerate with a
small oyster
muscle inside it. So to be able to do that, it has to grow in a hatchery. So majority of oyster farms now, they actually grow their oysters in the initial part of their life cycle in a hatchery. So they're called hatchery-raised oysters. So they fertilize the oyster in the hatchery. They create the substrate, artificial substrate. The oysters grow to a certain size. And then once they kind of a baby-looking oyster, they then place those oysters back into the ocean, and then they'll grow out. And that gives you that nice-looking oyster. But this means is that you artificially expanding the amount of, firstly, the number of oysters that would normally just grow in the Puget Sound. And you don't need to create an artificial substrate or create necessarily new substrates for the larvae to settle on. So all you're doing is you're taking the baby oyster and putting them back down on the mud flats to be able to grow out again, which means that all the old oyster that they used to collect when they would chuck the meat, that's not needed as much to place into the Sound. So that's one reason why.
Just based on how much we're farming them?
It's just the amount that we're farming them and the way that, the hatcheries are growing these oysters. So that's one reason. And then the other component too is that there's just natural die-off as well. So when they're collecting the oysters, there's just a natural mortality. I'm not sure exactly what the percent is when they're harvesting them, but there's a certain percent that are just dead and they can't be sold. So it's that shell as well that accumulates over time. So there's kind of a steady rate of shell just accumulating from the natural mortality of shell. And number two, when they bring the shell into the factories, some of it will go live into the restaurants, but they also continue to chuck some of the shell and bottle it. And then it's that shell that accumulates. So it's that excess shell, that's the shell that we're using, and then recycling for things like the landscaping industry, or as biofilters in some areas. Yeah.
I'll ask some more questions about oysters because they fascinate me. But let's get to the crux of your business. What were you doing before this?
So I was a fisheries specialist, like a technical specialist. I got a PhD in economics, and so I linked the component of fish growth, fish biology, with economics, which is the sustainable extraction of resources. So we would do things like what we would call bioeconomic work, and essentially what you're trying to do is understand the biology of the fish stock to figure out, okay, how quickly do these animals regenerate, and then from an economic standpoint, figuring out what's a sustainable extraction rate. So once you've figured that out, then you can begin to implement management measures around catch limits, size limits, and then you work with local governments to try to introduce legislation so that fishing companies will kind of ensure that they're not over harvesting. So I had built a career. I started my career actually in New Zealand. So I did a postdoc in New Zealand, thinking, I'll just go down for a year and then come back to the States. But I love New Zealand so much.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
You've been down there. It's a beautiful country, right? And I was a big surfer, and I was surfing a lot, and I was just loving the lifestyle. And I didn't have any kids. I wasn't married then. So it ended up being 13 years. And during that period, I'd married and got kids, but I also developed this career focusing on fisheries management in developing countries. So I'd work with donor agencies or the UN or the World Bank funding, and then go into these developing countries as a technical specialist and work with local authorities to try and improve fisheries management by collecting better data, and then how to use that data for fisheries management purposes. So I was doing a lot of traveling. I was away at home a lot, but I was loving it. Mm-hmm. And I'd spent a whole career doing that, and suddenly COVID hit, and I couldn't travel, and I was limited to the amount of work that I was doing. And that's when I thought, okay, let's take up this opportunity to see whether I can work some of these farms to recycle shell. Mm-hmm. And that's how it really turned out.
Wow.
So it was kind of but I also knew there was this this idea that we could actually use shell in landscaping. So I'd grown up in a family of landscapers. My mom owned a landscaping company, and I used to work for her as a kid.
Did you say you'd never do that when you grow up?
I did when I was a kid. I thought I hated this, but I actually, thinking about it, I really loved it. I mean, some of those times, working as a laborer and running around in these trucks, you learn by osmosis. And now I'm like in my early 50s, and I think back at those days, and I must have learned a lot, because now that I'm back in the landscaping industry, a lot of the stuff I just know.
Second nature,
it's intuition. And, it's amazing when you're young how you kind of...
Yeah, I used to hate gardening because our garden was so massive. We were off the grid for a long time, and that was our food supply, and butchering the animals, I didn't care for that either. But now, gardening's my favorite thing.
Yeah.
It's absolutely my favorite.
And it's calming, isn't it? It's really calming. Like,
it's my peaceful place.
It's so peaceful. Like, for me, my favorite day is when I'm actually working with the team. I hate having to sit in the office and take calls and do estimating. I just love just working with the team. Mm-hmm. I don't get an opportunity to do that very often anymore, but when I do it...
Yeah, your business grew quick.
Yeah.
A couple of things. It's funny because my son said you were from South Africa, and I was like, no, he's from New Zealand. And then I ran into you last week, and we started talking a bit, and you had such a New Zealand accent back then, and now I can see it's starting to wear off from the first time I met you.
Okay, yeah. But it's funny you say that with the accent. So when we moved here initially from New Zealand, my boys, they were 8 and I can't even remember, 8 and maybe 10 and 12, maybe around that age, and they had a strong New Zealand accent, right?
Right.
Because that's where they'd gone to school, and I came in with a South African accent, and some people get confused. South African, New Zealand, the Southern Hemisphere accents,
Australian,
kind of meld together. And then my wife, she was from Boston, so she had still a bit of a Boston. People used to get completely confused. Where the hell are you guys from?
Bainbridge. So COVID hits, and you don't get to travel, and you decide, I'm going to make a move. Now, did that start with just like one truck and yourself, or did you just use that economic degree and go crazy with a loan and get 12 people? How many people are working for you now?
Around 8 to 10, about 10 people. Yeah.
That's great.
And it's seasonal, keep in mind. I mean, in the summer, you're a lot busier. Mm-hmm. Once kind of the fall and winter comes in, things die down a lot.
Yeah, it's hard to make new driveways in the mud.
Exactly.
That one driveway between your house and my house turned out really good that you did.
Thanks, yeah.
I think on the island.
Yeah.
Is that how you say that road? Island? I know it's misspelled.
Island, yeah.
But okay.
Island way, yeah.
That turned out really nice. Now, did you just start with yourself, or how did that work out?
So when I started out, I had started working with just a local garden, like a small crew of people here on the island, because I didn't really have a crew, and my Spanish was pretty poor, even though I'd lived in Costa Rica. and most people speak English. So my Spanish was not great. But I started working with a small crew, and they started doing a lot of the installations for me. And at the time, I was unsure of, where this company was going to go. But we knew we had a point of difference utilizing shell and using that for landscaping. It was a new idea on the West Coast.
Because it's popular in like Cape Cod and Boston. And
absolutely. East Coast, you see it a lot, down Florida. But here on the West Coast, you don't see it as much.
No.
So it wasn't, and I think a lot of the landscapers, they get used to designing things a certain way. And when something has not really been here, so, and maybe a lot of them didn't really have access to the local shell. But so we started doing it, and there was definitely a demand. But what I learned early on was that shell doesn't work everywhere, number one. And number two, it's expensive. It's much more expensive than gravel. Because the oyster farms, they understand the demand for shell. So the city of Seattle, the city of Tacoma, they will buy the excess shell from the farms from time to time. And they use it to create new oyster beds, number one. And then also, like the Port of Seattle might buy a bunch of shell for those bifills that I was telling you about. So they knew what the potential price was. So it meant that I had to buy it at the same rate that they're selling it for. And then I had to process the shell. So we had to figure out, okay, how do you process this material and use it for landscaping? So there was some real upfront costs. And the machines that we use to process this material, it's essentially the same crushing machine that is used to crush gravel. So they're big, expensive machinery. So shell ends up being much more expensive than gravel. So it's not something that everyone can afford.
Now, is there a whitening process as well? Because I think oysters are kind of grayish, dull white. And when they come out on the, when I see them in your work, they seem bright white.
Not at all. So essentially, as soon as you take them out the water, they will just bleach out white. So we will tend to keep the shells outside for a couple seasons, and that just it kills all the algae and the growth that may be on the shell, removes the smell, so the smell is completely inert. And
where do you stack your shells?
So we have an agreement with one of the oyster farms that we work closely with, and they own some land. So we use that area to just dry out the shell and process the material.
And which farms are you in cahoots with? Or?
So one of the big farms we're working with now, it's Minterbrook Oyster Farm, and they're just local.
And where are they at?
And Purdy, the Carver area. Yeah. So we work with them, and so we're still a relatively small company, and it's much easier to just work with one farm because you can keep your machinery there, you can process it. Yeah. I mean, there will be a point where you may want to expand the company, into other areas.
And they don't have
Portland or
endless supply of shells either.
They do not have an endless supply.
So if you grow too much bigger.
Yeah. So you'd want to. So when you kind of move into a new area, you probably want to partner with a farm close to that area, and then that farm will supply kind of the business in that region. And that's kind of how I envision it may work. So at the moment, fortunately, the farm that we're working with, the amount that they are piling up is kind of at the rate that we're using the shell.
And how long has Scapes been around? 5 years now or so?
No, not even that. 3 years, 4 years, yeah.
You broke even yet?
I'd like to say yes, but sometimes I go, no. I mean, it's expensive to start a company, man.
Yeah,
right?
I do, because I've been an entrepreneur since I was 18.
Yeah.
And I've failed many a time, and failure is part of success in a lot of ways. But you learn a few things, and I can't imagine having the heavy machinery, plus the trucks that you drive are huge. Huge Gas is expensive. Minimum wage is high out here.
Really high. It's really high. I mean, you can't. A lot of these guys are big in demand. So if you have building a crew the only way to keep them, you need to pay them better than anyone else.
Right.
Because, there's no allegiance. So you need to, so for me, you want to build a crew, get guys that are hardworking, dedicated and knowledgeable, and then keep them. And the only way to keep them is to make sure that they're busy and you're paying them better than anyone else.
Happy and proud.
And that's the thing. And then the machinery is expensive. And the ferry. So,
because it's more for a bigger ride, right?
Yeah. You bring like our big 5-yard dump truck, bring it into the city, return. I mean, it's close to $150. It's crazy.
Your margins must be so small.
They are small. In landscaping, margins are not big. It's one of those things that you just gotta, I enjoy it, I love it, but it's not going to make you super wealthy. Yeah.
So, what's the long-term plan for you?
So, the good thing is that the business is keeping me local, which is awesome. Because now my kids, they're both at high school now, and I just love the fact that on the weekends I'm here and I'm around. So that's really important for me. And we've really expanded the business to the point where the shell is just one component. So yes.
Right. Because when you first started, it was all shells. And now I see that you do some very comprehensive landscaping work.
Yeah, so we do, full, design, build, install for all types of hardscape. So shell's just one of the surfaces options. So we're always looking for kind of alternative ideas. So one other thing that we've starting to use is something called resin bound, and it's a product that they've been doing in the UK for several years now. But and I learned about it just from my travels and the time that I've spent in the UK, and I thought, well, this could be a really good solution for the Pacific Northwest because the weather is very similar here. Mm-hmm. And what it is essentially is you're taking an aggregate such as pea gravel or other colored aggregate, and you're mixing it in with this. It's a permeable resin, and you mix it, and it's an alternative to a concrete driveway. Mm-hmm. So it creates a surface that still gives you that aggregate look, but it's completely permeable, number one, and it doesn't move. If you're putting a driveway with gravel, you're always getting ruts and holes, and it's sliding, and you could never build a driveway with pea gravel, just go everywhere. But with this resin, it's as hard as concrete, but it's permeable. Because often, and I say that because a lot of new builds, you need to have that permeable to non-permeable ratio, particularly for homes that are closer to the waterfront, and this just creates a permeable drive.
Now, when you lay down oyster shells, do you have to put something under them, like sand or gravel as well?
Yeah, for sure. So you need to put a good substrate of gravel. I mean, because shell's so expensive, we tend to just do it as the very top surface layer. So we will put 6-8 inches of gravel as your sub-layer, and sometimes, depending on the slope of the driveway, we may need to lay the gravel within a geocell. It kind of holds the gravel in place, and then we put the shell on top, the crushed oyster shell on top, and then that's compacted, and that will kind of recalcify and get quite hard.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm pausing here, but I'm visualizing all the things I can do with my yard. Cape Town, it's got 11 languages. Is English your first language?
Yeah, English is my first language, yeah. So it's an interesting country. Nelson Mandela calls it the Rainbow Nation, and it really is that. So, Cape Town is an old city. And I think Europeans started to settle there in the mid-1600s because it used to be a trading port, before, I guess, the Suez Canal was dug. The only way to get to India or to the Far East is to kind of go via the Cape of Good Hope. And so Cape Town was one of those areas where people would resupply. So a very old city, Europeans settled there in the mid-1600s, and the first Europeans to settle there weren't actually the English. It was the Dutch. I guess back then they had big, quite a big superpower and had trading ships. And so the Dutch, kind of that Dutch language kind of evolved into like a local language, which they call Afrikaans today.
Afrikaans and Zulu.
Afrikaans. It's a kind of a mixture of Dutch. It has some African words in it, and it has French words in it, because the French kind of were some early settlers as well. And then, because they have great wineries down there, so the French, those wineries are, started established in the 1700s by the French. So, but the English only arrived like in the 1800s, and so that's kind of when my kind of family, kind of started to come in, and the English, arrived. They thought, they found. I think they started to find gold and diamonds in southern Africa, and I think the British thought, well, that would be good to have, and so it became there was a couple wars down there, and they called them the Boer Wars, and then it became a British empire, British colony. It was a British colony right up until the Second World War, and then the Second World War arrived, and then after the war, there was a new government that came in. Was actually kind of an Afrikaans, more conservative government, and that's when apartheid kind of really took force just after the war, and then that kind of stayed right until Mandela was released from prison.
And he was in prison in Cape Town, right?
Yeah, he was in prison in Cape Town. Yeah.
Were you in Cape Town while he was incarcerated?
Absolutely, yeah. So
and what was the vibe like in your neighborhood?
So, growing up in apartheid, I was a young kid, but I think that a lot of the media was, suppressed. And so you didn't really hear much about him at all. You knew, he was around, and he was on Robben Island, and then he was at another local prison in Pollsmoor, but he... whatever, my guess is that, it was probably illegal to talk about him in the press back then. The government was really, they really kind of clamped down on shit like that, and unfortunately, and that was one of the reasons why my father, he was a physician in Cape Town, and he hated apartheid. And I remember when I was very young, he used to go and work, in the townships, which are a lot of the kind of little towns, shanty towns that kind of started to build up around a lot of the larger cities, because a lot of the laborers would come in from these homeland areas, more traditional farming homelands, and settle around the cities looking for work. And they were essentially like shanty towns with poor sanitation, medicine, education. So he would go and work in those areas. I remember as a kid, he would go in and just kind of volunteer, and he just hated the regime. And back in the 80s, he didn't foresee what the future was going to be like. Releasing Mandela, new government. So he got a chance to move to the US. My folks had separated when I was very young, and so he moved here. And I still stood at high school. And so when I finished high school, that's when, I got this green card. And but by then, when I left South Africa, things had already started to change. Like Nelson Mandela had already been released from prison. They were going to have the first multiracial election since ever. And so it was a big deal, but I thought, hey, this was a chance to come to the US, see what it's going to be like. And I just kept an open mind, right? But I settled here, and I liked it, and I've kind of built a life for myself here.
Is Bainbridge Island and Seattle comparable to Cape Town in any fashion, other than Seattle being a port and Cape Town being a port?
It's hard. Like Cape Town, it's a developing country. There's some similarities, but... people often ask me, like, what's it like? And what was it like in apartheid? It's hard to explain because it was such a unique kind of thing, apartheid. But maybe, the closest I can think, maybe it was kind of like growing up in Mexico, in a middle class family, a wealthy family, you kind of in this developing country, but if you're wealthier, you have access to pretty much first world things, and a lot of the cities kind of evolved, into kind of developed countries, but it's kind of this kind of dichotomy of like very rich and very poor, and so you have a lot of the benefits of living kind of a developing country, but yeah.
Are you a big reggae music fan?
I'm not huge, but I do like reggae. I actually like all types of music.
Yeah, a couple favorite artists at all?
There's a guy that I actually just found that I really love. He's a British artist. His name Nick Melvey. Freaking great, man. He was he actually came to Seattle probably, I want to say, 6 months ago. And I went to go and see him. So, I listened to Spotify, in my car and while I was driving around, and I came across this guy, kind of indie type of music, kind of folk. I tend to listen to a lot of like indie rock, and he popped up, and so I'm listening to a lot of him at the moment.
Nice.
He's awesome, yeah.
I'll let you get back to work here. What are some of your big plans for the future, and do you have any municipality type work where you work with cities and governments on like the rain off? I think that's a great idea. I'd love to see you dump a bunch of shells down by the ferry and such. Yeah,
we've started to work with some of the parks. So here on Bainbridge Island, we were working with the Parks Board. We did a little project for them down in Pritchard Park. They kind of built a little monument down on the waterfront, and we're using the resin bound for some of their pathways and around this monument. It works really well there. Permeable surface, the guys like it. They kind of like the look. So I think we'll do more and more of that and try to introduce more shell. Like we'll use the shell if it's in the right area, if it works well. Mm-hmm. We don't want to kind of force it on everyone. I mean, I think when we started our company, we're still learning about the material, understanding, how it works, where to use it. But I think we have a much better sense of like how and where to use it now. And then also trying to incorporate other new materials. So when we work with clients, if they like the look of the shell, but we go to the site and we say it's just, this may not be the best place for it. Because, with a lot of the fir trees here, a lot of the needles will kind of come in and maybe ruin the look of it. Or if it's in an area that is very damp or under a lot of shade, you may get algae growth. You can kind of get that patina look. Some people like it, but it's something that we've kind of learnt about, that we just need to make sure that wherever it's installed, that, those potential issues are made aware, or, in areas where there's a good amount of sunlight, it works great, man. Particularly those homes that are right on the water, because essentially using a material, it's a local material. It's like literally the shell on your doorstep.
Right.
That's what I love about it too. It's just local material. Yeah.
That's cool how passionate you are. I think it's a niche idea, but I think just like this podcast is pretty niche. It's Bainbridge Island centric, but it's nice to have additional things. So you're just not a one-trick pony.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, Mike. Shell-scapes.com if you want to learn more or hire Michael for your landscaping. Mark, I'm sorry. That's why I tell everybody I'm Timothy, not Tim, because you get Mike and Mark all mixed up. Mark. Call Mark at shellscapes.com. My apologies. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Timothy. I appreciate it.
I appreciate the conversation. It was good. You've been listening to B.I.STANDER Podcast. Be kind.